Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Deirdre Fulton and I'm a partner at Midas Aviation and I'll be moderating today's discussion. This is OEG's second series of webinars focusing on COVID-19, and it's good to see that some of you who joined us last time have come back for more, and of course welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. I'm joined today by John Grant, OEG's senior analyst, who's been tracking the impacts since the start of the coronavirus outbreak. And we also have Mark Clarkson joining us today, OEG's EVP of Product Management. And finally, we're pleased that KK Ong, Director of Network Planning from Cebu Pacific, is able to join us today too. And I'm sure KK will be able to give us some interesting insights from an airline perspective later, along with the rest of the panel. Now, as we said on our last webinar, most, if not all of us, are joining from our home offices, hastily constructed today. So there may well be some background noises, barking dogs, noisy children, and other bizarre noises. We hope not, and we'll do our best, of course, to minimise those. So we're going to step right in. We're going to have a look at some OEG data today and analysis, and have our experts take a deeper look into the COVID-19 crisis and the ongoing impact on the air travel market, refreshing some of the data that we looked at 2 weeks ago and discussing what this might mean for the industry. Now, for those of you who signed up for this particular webinar, we also have a second one later today that's going out, I think at 3 p.m. British Summer Time. There'll be a slightly different focus on that one, although we'll be covering the same data and we have a different panel talking on that one. So if you're interested, check that one out too, and you can always sign up for that and receive a recording to listen at a later date. Once we've gone through looking at some of the key trends and understanding what's happening perhaps across international and domestic markets, what the implications of that might be, we'll have some time for questions. Please send those in to us throughout. We got through quite a lot the last time, and we always take time afterwards to follow up and answer any questions that we haven't answered during the session. So please do that as we go. You also will get a copy of the recording of the webinar, so you can listen back if there's anything that you wanted to hear again. Okay, so we're going to get started now. John, I'm going to come to you first. This is an interesting slide here. Do you want to talk to us a bit about what we're seeing here and what the context of this is?
Absolutely. So, hi, good morning, everybody. We have been developing new ways of looking at the data in the last couple of weeks, combining both OAG schedules data, on-time performance data, and also some data from some external sources around the COVID-19 event and the number of reported cases. And this is just a snapshot of 3 of those data sets put together on one chart, and it's here for a reason that the next slide will perhaps help in some ways as well. But the black line is the number of scheduled flights that were planned from France. So this is just the country level for France, but we can do this for all of the major markets and indeed most of the major airlines. So here you can see how over a period of time from the 1st of March through to Monday, the level of capacity, the black line, number of flights fell quite dramatically, particularly from around the 18th of March. But at the same time, that was in parallel with the growth in the number of COVID cases that were being reported, which is the blue bar.
The blue line, isn't it?
Yeah. And around the 22nd of March, we began to see a very noticeable increase in the percentage of flights and the number of actual flights that were being cancelled, because as this event is occurring, and it is very dynamic and real time, as these cases are taking place, of course, Airlines are responding as rapidly as they can to demand, and
course, yeah.
travel restrictions from other governments, etc. So at that point, the quickest way to handle that is actually for the airlines to begin to cancel flights as they work their way through what they're going to do to their network and how they're going to adjust that. And I know we can talk to KK about that later. And how that works, but so that is sort of like the trail that takes place in this process. And then I thought it might be worth just sharing the next slide with people. So Mark and I put this together because it sort of reflects how the process takes place. So typically an airline CEO or someone announces major schedule changes, and before that the network team will have worked on the scale of those cuts, but quite frequently not the precise detail. But as soon as they start doing that and the airline closes flights for sale in its systems, Mark, we begin to see some of the schedules changes coming through, don't we?
Yeah, that's right, John, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It can be literally at that moment. You know, we have a number of also hundreds of connections with the airlines across the world, and depending on how we're connected with those airlines, it can literally be at the same time, and in some cases before. But that is maybe in calmer market conditions than we're seeing just now. So, you know, we have a range of carriers that, you know, we are connected to, if you like, on a real-time basis, and then we have, you know, many hundreds of airlines effectively that will provide us SIM files, which is effectively, you know, a full recap or a partial recap of their entire network. And depending on how we're connected with those airlines and what systems they have, that sort of dictates that there is naturally a different rhythm of how we get those schedules updated. And
of course, what's happened, the intensity of change and the scale of change we are seeing now is extraordinary, and the volumes of changes the airlines are making. So once the flight has been closed for sale, the airline has to begin that process of reaccommodating passengers. Now, for many, that may be just a straight pure cancellation, but for others, it may be that they want to be reaccommodated onto another flight. It may be that there is a connection to another onward flight that needs to be adjusted and changed. And that process, if you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of bookings, however automated it has become, and however much the passenger is given access to make those changes themselves, there is still a lot of work to be done. And of course, during that
labor
stage,
intensive, isn't it, for the airline?
Completely. And during that stage, of course, the airline also has to then advise its codeshare partners. And as we all know, you know, many of the major airlines have 17, 18, 20 codeshare partners. And they've got to get those flights advised, changes notified, and adjust their schedules in their codeshare flights as well, because the last thing the airline needs, of course, is a codeshare partner still to be selling the flight when actually they cannot get a seat. It just creates frustration for everyone.
I think that's a really important point, John. I mean, you know, we've looked at the database and again in calmer times, and you know, we've got some flights that have, you know, 18, 19, 20 different codeshare partners on one single flight. And when you start to multiply that out in terms of needing to remove that schedule and have all of those carriers repatriate or cancel the bookings and the schedule, it's a huge process. Typically, we would, in a normal day, if you like, we would have around 120, 125,000 schedule changes, which, you know, could be something as small as a meal code on a flight, or it could be a carrier launching or changing a route. But around about 125,000 a day. And over the last 1 to 2 months, the volume of changes has just been staggering, frankly. So it's definitely unprecedented times.
So once all of those changes have been accommodated, you know, and we will still be getting files coming through from some other airlines, because as Mark said, hundreds have direct access, but some send their files through via other means and processes. as Rothner Begum explained 2 weeks ago on the webinar, that data is then immediately processed and is available for redistribution out to OAG's customers. And I think, one of the takeaways, even at this early stage, is the need to regularly refresh data is becoming more and more important as we go through COVID-19 and all of the change processes that we are seeing. So the airline updates. Airlines, GDSs update their database with the new schedules, and depending on the GDS mark, I think some of them take a dynamic feed and some may take a feed from OAG maybe 2 or 3 times a week.
Yeah, it's a wide spectrum, and dynamic schedules is effectively a real-time delivery service. So as carriers are providing us with their schedule, whether that is SIM recap, whether that is SSM, which is obviously effectively a kind of real-time push through, or even in some cases where we've got direct API access with the airline and therefore what they have on sale through that API. It's a kind of weird and wonderful different mix of update frequencies that we have.
So at that point, the airline's new schedule is on sale, but, and I think this is an important point, and we get feedback and we sometimes share the same frustrations as perhaps some of our customers do, that may not quite yet be in Schedules Analyzer, which is refreshed on a weekly basis and generally available on a Monday morning. So there is a time lag in the data, and in the data we will see today, we will see some things where people may say, well, that doesn't look quite right because I know this, and you're absolutely right. And it is a snapshot, and it is the best snapshot that is out there, and it is constantly being refreshed. And of course, when we get Schedules Analyzer correct and validated and up to date, the airlines, as we've gone through COVID, then start making another set of changes and we start again. So it is a completely iterative process of schedules adjustment that we are working through at this moment in time. So I think it's worth, it may have taken a bit of time to go through, but I think it's really worth understanding how it all plays out.
Yeah, and I think it's just also important to quickly reflect as well that in the vast majority of cases, obviously airlines send in the schedules and they are fine and they go through the various quality control checks, and it's fine. But the team also has a pretty significant role in making sure that those schedules are correct. So, and quite often we have to have discussion or connection with the carrier to validate some of the schedules, because there might be something in there that's not necessarily correct or that they want to be sort of distributed, and that process is even more heightened and challenged in these difficult times.
Okay, I think that's really helpful and insightful, and I guess resonates with all of us are trying to keep track of what's happening in the industry, in terms of which countries are open or closed and how things are panning out. So I think it's really useful to just have your insight on how the process is working in the context of OAG's data. So thank you for that. We'll move on to our next slide now. So we showed this a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
What we can see here clearly is the red map or the spread of red has really taken hold, hasn't it, right across almost every country, John?
It has. So we're comparing same week in 2019 versus 2020, and you can see that someone got a set of red colouring pens for Christmas and has been liberally painting in most of the globe as we've worked our way through this crisis, COVID-19. Total capacity is now fallen from 109 million to just 39 million as of the 6th of April. In fact, it's still heading downwards. We've seen vast amounts, over half of that capacity cut occurring in the last 2 weeks as Europe and many major European airlines made significant cuts and we've seen some of the US majors, in fact, all of the 3 big US legacy airlines have started making capacity cuts, both internationally and on their domestic networks. And if there is any sort of glimmer of hope in those horrible headline numbers, it is that many of these countries have now probably reached a point in the available capacity that they cannot go any lower. Many airlines have made 90+% cuts in their capacity in the last couple of weeks.
I think if we go on to the next slide, we'll see that, won't we?
We can. So, I mean, flights are down by 51% in Asia this week, 76% in Southwest Pacific, as airlines like Qantas and Air New Zealand have essentially, apart from some repatriation flights, ceased operation for this moment in time. The impact of China's restrictions on international flights that they imposed a week ago last Friday are apparent, although we are seeing some upturn in domestic capacity. In Europe, flights are down by over 80% compared to last year. And then some of the major markets, it's quite dramatic. And as I say, we're beginning to see this pattern replicating itself in North America. But it might be worth KK sharing some of his thoughts about Asia Pacific and how's that going at the moment. KK, it looks as though you're having a hard time there.
Yeah, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. To be really honest, it's quite difficult to predict how this will pan out. We are busy trying to do multiple iterations to our plan, depending on what has happened. On the domestic front, probably, I think it will be stronger than the international sector. But on the international front, I think it very much depends on the government regulations, the travel ban. And it's not even the direct travel ban. Some of the government actually impose a certain condition where if you have been to these countries within the last 14 days, you're not allowed to enter. This actually makes the demand forecast very difficult because people may not be able to travel to certain countries simply because they were in certain countries over the last 14 days.
Yeah, and keeping track of that is really difficult, isn't it?
It's tough, yeah. I mean, you know, the industry has been pushing for so much cost savings on electronic check-in and things like this, but all this has to be disabled right now because we basically need someone to go through or even interview the passengers or to go through their passport to see whether they have been to certain countries.
Okay, fascinating. I mean, just to point out a couple of other things here. I mean, obviously in Europe, in a typical week, if we looked at the data on a global basis, there would be a number of European countries that would feature in the top 10 markets around the globe. And as of this week, there are no European countries in the top 10 global data sets. So, you know, we have seen some quite dramatic cuts in the levels of production from many of the carriers. And those that, you know, yes, there are some commercial flights still operating, but as this chart here, I think
we can see that here, can't we? That
absolutely.
You know, these sort of figures indicate that there's very little left operating, although you know, somewhere between sort of 8 to 10% looks like it's operating. What are these flights, John, in these countries that are locked down and no one's traveling?
Yeah, so some of those flights that are still being operated are repatriation flights. And, you know, so that's Lufthansa sending 2 aircraft to Christchurch, New Zealand to bring back stranded German tourists. It's British Airways flying to Lima, Peru to bring back UK nationals and such like. And there are still some commercially scheduled services operating around the world, and we'll highlight this in a bit more detail later. But you know, most of the US majors and some of the European airlines are still operating transatlantic services to the major gateways: Heathrow, Chicago, New York, Frankfurt, and there are still some services down into Asia from Europe. Chinese international services, although restricted, are beginning to reappear. And I saw that there were some flights to London that operated yesterday from China. But
and we'll take a look in a while, won't we? At
we will. But I
China,
think,
domestic
yeah,
and international.
absolutely. But I think what we see here is, most of those countries are, and that's why I think, if anything, there is a little bit of hope here that we have probably plateaued at the bottom of a very bumpy road in many markets. But there are still some countries where either there is a lot of capacity that we would expect to come out as COVID accelerates its travel around the globe, or that are so dependent on domestic travel and domestic capacity. There are some very large countries that we seem to just forget about on occasions, like China, the United States, and Russia, where the only way to get effectively around those countries sometimes is by air service, and therefore the continuance of those air services and the CARES Act that the US government has passed in recent weeks speaks to that particular point. The retention of domestic services is very important.
Yeah,
John,
for people that have no alternative but to travel.
John, sorry,
Okay.
can I add on to this? Yeah. I think besides the repatriation flight, some of the minimum numbers of flight that you see here may potentially be the airlines operating a passenger flight on the, especially the wide-body passenger flight, but for the belly hold cargo capacity. So the capacity may be published, but I think at times we probably see more cabin crew than passengers on board.
Yeah.
Good point,
Okay.
KK.
Yeah.
If we take a look at just a different perspective, I guess, in terms of visually what some of those reductions look like in some of the bigger markets in Asia. I mean, you can see clearly the situation in China, which we'll come on to look at in a little bit more detail in a moment. Potentially looks like things have recovered a little. I think it's really interesting to look at South Korea and potentially Japan, that there hasn't been in South Korea as steep a fall as markets like Singapore, Australia, the Philippines, and even China. And we hear a lot, don't we, about the regime of testing and case tracking in South Korea. We of course can't speculate about what difference that's making. I think lots of people around the world are doing that, but it's interesting from Japan's perspective that will Japan see a similar pattern to South Korea, do we think, or is there still a sharp drop off?
Well, yeah, clearly there is undoubtedly a correlation between government response and the levels of air capacity. I mean, that's a no-brainer in terms of the linkage. But I've deliberately, in some ways, and I think we've consciously not looked beyond this week, the 6th of April, because airlines are adjusting their schedules for the reasons we went through very early on in this webinar. But in some of these markets, there's actually a bit more of a positive upturn in capacity. So, in China, we're aware that there is a significant increase in domestic capacity planned for the May public holidays that they will be enjoying in a few weeks' time. And of course, in South Korea, they appear to have done a very good job of controlling COVID-19, and the capacity cuts have not been dramatic. Japan, now we have the 72 international country restrictions for nationals from those particular markets. We may see reductions in capacity beyond what we've seen already. And British Airways are just one airline that have now cancelled all their services to Japan. But the strength of the Japanese market is the domestic market, and it continues to operate in nearly the same levels of capacity and volumes as in previous years. And KK, I think many of the markets that Cebu are in are, at least they're not declining any further in terms of capacity, are they?
Basically, I mean, the country is in lockdown right now. We're not operating any flights. But on service resumption, when the quarantine is lifted, we expect it won't go back to the pre-COVID level immediately. But I think domestic is definitely more resilient than international. But one thing to note is not all the domestic market capacity is being consumed by domestic travelers, right? There will be international travelers traveling to domestic sectors as well, which I think we need to really try to find a gauge on how big this market is. I think this market may not come back to the domestic travel so soon.
Sure. Okay. Building on that, I guess. You know, we're seeing, aren't we, that domestic markets, for a variety of reasons, are more resilient for now. And we thought it would be interesting to just show, you know, or the start of the crisis, the percentage of worldwide flights that operate domestically and internationally. You can see that it was around 71% at the outset, and actually that's fallen. International flights have fallen to the point that now 9 out of 10 essentially flights operating are domestic, aren't they?
They are, and I think this is an important point, because it's not just about the way capacity has been cut and what markets and what segments, but also about how we could expect the market to recover as we come out of this, because I think there is increasing sentiment that the world that we used to have within the aviation industry is not going to be the one we return to, and there will be significant changes in structure, the airlines, but also the types of networks that are operated. And for people out there, you know, I think certainly in the first phase of recovery, much of what we're going to see is going to be around domestic services, and consumer confidence being rebuilt around flying on domestic services, rather than long haul journeys for leisure. Particularly the fear of perhaps not being able to repatriate at short notice, if necessary, I think will prey on many people's minds. Now, there is an interesting question: do we think that Europe is a domestic market now, and therefore we'd see a wider recovery there? I think that's an interesting point. But I think what KK was just saying earlier about, for many of these domestic services, the reliance on international travellers to fill probably 30 or 40% of that capacity, and maybe more on some selected routes, means that, you know, there will still be a shortage of domestic demand, and therefore probably domestic capacity as we come out of COVID-19, if it's in June, July, or September, whenever it happens to be.
I think it's timely then to look at China's domestic picture, isn't it? You know, in terms of, and we almost, what we do and we don't we want to have a sort of predictive line going forward here?
Yeah, we have the data and we've put it there, and you know, we know that, as I said, the Chinese airlines are putting more capacity in, but equally they need to see stronger shoots of recovery in terms of demand as well. So what we're showing here is Chinese domestic capacity, which for the last 7 weeks, 6-7 weeks, has been pretty consistent. But at the same time, we've seen quite high rates of cancellation. The shaded yellow orangey area on the chart to the right shows you the number of daily cancellations that we've been seeing in China on domestic services. So you can see that since that
still tracking quite high, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about somewhere between 15 and 20% of flights being cancelled now. In most markets, in regular circumstances, we would be expecting cancellation rates to be less than 1 or 2%, because, you know, airlines look at dispatch reliability as a key performance measurement. KK, how has Cebu been performing in terms of cancellations before flights? Were you cancelling or?
We take a more proactive approach on the basis that we don't want to disrupt the travel plans of the guests. So we will try to cancel in advance, unless there's a new government regulation that comes in. I think that one is beyond our control. So those are the changes that we may have to do almost immediately, according to the travel ban imposed by the government. But as far as within, sorry.
Go on. No, go on, please.
No, I was just saying, like, in terms of being for the commercial consideration, we consistently do our forecast. We consistently look at the numbers. So we try to bring forward the changes as early as we can, because keeping the changes to the last minute doesn't help anyone, not the guests, not our operational people as well.
And I think this is an interesting point in the context of some of the government steps that we are seeing around the globe, and this is in pretty stark contrast to what we would expect to see in the US domestic market now that they have implemented the CARES Act, whereby airlines are essentially mandated, and indeed it actually says in the CARES Act that OAG's data is the reference point for the measurement of performance, which is quite flattering. That there are not.
Sorry, John. We'll look this afternoon, won't we, in our second webinar specifically at these data sets, but for the US market.
We will, but here, I think the point is, in the US market, those rates of cancellation would not be acceptable under the CARES Act. So it shows how airlines and government regulatory authorities are handling this in different ways.
I think there's also the question that's been rumbling around now for the last few weeks is also about demand, both from a business and leisure perspective. To what extent are we seeing, yes, obviously demand being frustrated by lack of access from government restrictions perspective, but also corporate demand potentially being impacted by the realization that the alternatives, in terms of keeping businesses operating, are a good alternative or are working in some cases.
Absolutely.
I think we're on the tip of that iceberg, aren't we, in terms of actually just seeing how that is going to pan out.
We are.
I wonder whether there will be a frustration with it at some point when we realise that actually human contact in many sectors is still needed.
Yeah, and testimony to that, 560 people on a webinar here. Things like dress code have completely gone off people's radars. I'm sitting here in a football shirt for my favourite team, and
thank heavens for no video.
Exactly. It's bright yellow, and it's got a seagull on it. But it's that sort of are we going to return to the historic and traditional ways of doing business? It will be fascinating. There are some industries where travel is essential, but there are others where perhaps corporate budget holders may be thinking twice now before, and of course from a duty of care, putting people on aircraft. But there you go.
And I think as we potentially see this line start to recover, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, really. Let's look at the international picture now for China quickly.
Yeah, so very quickly, what we've seen, two elements here which are quite interesting. The first is that second tranche of capacity cuts that we've seen. And because we've reached that lower point, in terms of the cancellation rate, it has been much lower in the international market, aside from this small period at the end of March, early April, when the new international travel restriction or number of flights being operated was put into force. Absolutely. So there is much more, there is much more continuity. There is much more of an established operational program. And of course, those international flights are also statements about connectivity to the rest of the world. So that's important. But but that second tranche of capacity cuts, which is all around inbound COVID, returning Chinese nationals, is going to be interesting to see when that begins to recover as well.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, we'll watch with interest on that. Let's change tack very slightly now for a moment and pick up a little bit on what we were starting to talk about there. So after the last webinar, we asked some questions of participants to try and gauge the mood of the industry, and this is what we saw. So I think it's really interesting to see that at that point, so this was 2 weeks ago, which is a long time in current times. May was when people were feeling like the peak impact of their business was going to hit. And there's some interesting thoughts about medium-term impacts on people travelling less for both business and leisure. And you can see that you know, the economic uncertainty and the availability of affordable fares were the sort of key things that that respondents felt would impact on demand. I think you know, we talked just briefly previously about corporate demand, and it's going to be interesting to see you know, to what extent these are the sort of pressing issues as we go forward.
It would be interesting, KK, I mean, from your perspective as a network strategist, in a part of the world that's been heavily influenced by this, without giving away any commercial secrets, what's your personal perspective of when the peak will occur, or has it occurred?
Definitely has not occurred, simply because I think besides China and Korea that has probably done mass testing, the other parts of the other countries in Asia are quite slow in doing the test, right? So we will only know the peak when the respective governments can actually perform mass testing. That is only when, I mean, the cases will continue to go up until when they have done mass testing that you can actually see the curve being flattened. So besides China and Korea, I think for the rest of Asia, probably end of this month at the earliest, we will see the peak.
Right.
And that's good, and that's going to ripple through to the long haul market, isn't it, for Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, isn't it? You know, with booking trends perhaps a year out, we're not going to see any forward bookings, are we, at the moment?
No,
No.
I can't see it. I mean, KK, are you seeing much booking activity in your market?
No. I mean, I think it'll probably take a bit of time to recover. I think right now we are in the situation where the health concern is a primary concern. But I think after we are done with this health concern, the next stage is probably the financial considerations. I think quite a lot of people are getting lesser income due to this COVID-19 impact, and I think that will basically translate into a smaller demand for non-essential travel.
Yeah. And I think actually, which that leads us quite nicely on to our next point about, you know, we asked the question towards the end of our survey about what participants thought appropriate short-term and medium short-term measures would be for governments to take, and we're going to come on and talk a little bit about that in a moment, and what we thought the medium-term impact might be on the industry. And you know, clearly within the industry there's a well-developed understanding that support in whatever form that needs to be. In the US, obviously the CARES Act, in other parts of the world there are other conversations going on. I think the challenge is going to be for that message to sit comfortably alongside all of the other economic constraints that governments are going to be dealing with over the coming
very
months.
tough, isn't it? I mean, you know, this is ultimately IATA's last forecast was a $252 billion impact on revenues for 2020. Now, from that point, that works out at about 44% of the industry's revenues. The industry operates on a 7 to a 10% return on capital employed, and on that basis, you don't need to be a genius to work out what this is doing and why the funding is so necessary for many airlines to survive. But equally, this is a reality check, and it is a fittest of the fittest will come out of this in strong positions. It will take time for the recovery and for the balance sheets to recover, and that can take up to 3 to 5 years, I think, realistically. But we are seeing some big calls already being made by major airlines around the world, such as Lufthansa yesterday announced that they're going to stop operating 6 of their A380s. 75% of the world's airline fleets are now grounded. If you're a plane spotter, you need to head to probably one of 5 airports around the world that literally has
if you can get there.
If you can get Roswell in Georgia has, I think, 300 aircraft parked up from various airlines in the United States that were flying less than a month ago. So there is plenty of change taking place, which in many ways is sad because it's people's careers and jobs, but equally, if we try to look optimistic, this is an exciting time as well, because there will be change taking place, and change sometimes is good.
Yeah, I'm not sure it might feel like that quite just yet out there in the industry, but I think that's the reality, isn't it? That change in one form or another is what is going to be the catalyst here.
Is it maybe an important theme to touch on? There seems to be a few questions coming in on this basis. It's the question around sustainability again, and as more and more, I guess, in some cases, governments get involved in part nationalising or renationalising airlines against very heavily publicised sustainability targets. As we start to see that growth in capacity coming back, there's maybe sort of conflicting strategy there of an airline that's wanting to grow back to somewhere close to what they were, and maybe having a government with significant ownership or interest in that airline trying to strain that growth to match up to sustainability targets. Feels like there's maybe some potential conflict coming there.
I think there's absolutely a question mark, isn't there, about whether the sorts of, just for the purposes of the slide that we've got here, what we're showing is the funding that has been requested or secured by specific airlines, or in the case of countries, the UK in red, versus size, to give a sense of that. There's got to be a question about governments making support conditional on achieving sustainability targets. That hasn't.
And that hasn't happened yet. And it will be interesting. We have Jeremy Robinson joining us this afternoon's webinar, who's probably the top aviation lawyer in Europe. He's he's really got his finger on the pulse, and I know he's beginning to raise the discussion about what are the conditions that airlines are going to have imposed on them for loan checks and other government support. And it is not just about financial performance, but now is the time that we should be trying to merge some of the sustainability criteria that we have as an industry and with individual airlines into those conditions of support that are provided. And it's a very fine balancing act between taking those sustainability criteria too far as compared to making them in the interest of the wider public. So, use of more disposable equipment, biofuels, hybrid electric vehicles, etc., around airports, and all of these sort of things. So it's a fascinating, it is a paradigm point in terms of how the industry behaves going forward, as well as who is in the industry to behave.
I think it's also really challenging when you've got governments around the world that are almost on a different page, both in terms of where they are in the cycle of dealing with the pandemic, either starting to come through the other side and having capacity to think about the wider economic impact and how they respond to that. But also, there are simply countries where there will not be the ability to provide the sort of government funding that that carriers might need. And then there's a wider question, isn't there, about who should benefit from this?
Absolutely, and
what would the
there is,
criteria be for government support?
Precisely, there is no justification for someone or a government or some other body propping up a failing industry or airline that, quite frankly, is just going to be a diversion of valuable taxpayers' resources. There are wonderful examples throughout Europe and other parts of the world where ultimately governments have made really brave decisions and allowed their national airlines to fail, and the country and the market has continued to see growth in air traffic and demand. And Hungary is a great example where Malev, Hungarian Airlines, finally collapsed, and everyone said this is a national disaster, but the truth is the airport is seeing more and more traffic, it's got a better range of customers, and it's a better use of taxpayer money. And we will see that in some parts of Asia, undoubtedly, where airlines will go through, sadly, that same process.
I think that leads us really nicely into our sort of question and answer session. And one of the questions that someone's asked, Michelle, thank you, Michelle Dye, thanks for asking this one. For governments that don't have the financial capability to give financial assistance to airlines, what other options are there? What options do they have to keep to restart their economy?
Well, firstly, I think there are for every locally based airline, there are many other inbound airlines who could offer that capacity and may be better placed to offer that capacity. So an airport's network is made up of many airline customers, and importantly, I think now is the time not to abandon those customers, but to be talking to them as much as they want to talk to you, and discussing what your hopes and ambitions are for your airport and your network as you come out of this. KK, how many discussions have you had with airports in the last couple of weeks about future network size and shape?
Quite a lot, as in I start knocking on doors to ask for some form of discounts or a partnership that we can actually reinsert capacity. I think we basically want the airport partners to help us in these difficult times. So if we can put forward a case like there are certain markets which it's quite risky for me to put the wide body back on immediately, but if we can work together, I may just choose to deploy the wide body rather than the narrow body. So it's kind of win-win, right? Rather than the airline has to take the risk unilaterally. I think it's quite tough on us right now. I had quite a few discussions with the airport partners where they claim they also have zero revenue in the past month or so. But I think the airlines are in a more difficult situation where we have to deal with refunds and our lease payment as well, our aircraft lease payment. I think that will probably separate us from the airport operators.
And we've seen, KK, really positive examples of governments that have sort of immediately appreciated those challenges. I think Norway came out really early, weeks and weeks and weeks ago now, freezing airport charges for a number of weeks to just try and share some of that collective pain. Again, though, that's not something that is an option for all countries or indeed all airports. A slightly different question now. This is an interesting one. As we've heard about, and I think the industry is starting to think now about, once we start flying again and passengers start travelling through our airports in greater volumes, should all airports have health controls? So if we need to have health screening to get into an airport, is that something that's going to happen across regional airports, or is that something that could be restricted just to main hubs, to the border control aspect?
Very difficult, isn't it? Because in this world of connected travelers, and you take the United Kingdom, for example, there are somewhere like, I think it's about 21 or 22 UK cities that have connectivity to Amsterdam. And some of those are very large, such as London Heathrow, but others are quite small, such as Cardiff and Humberside and Teesside. And their passenger throughputs are measured in tens of thousands of passengers at best per month, and even some cases per annum. And can they economically justify the cost of those additional health screening measures that may be required? And it will then come down, I guess, to a question: does the government pay for those? Does the health authorities, the control authorities pay for those, or is the airport responsible for developing those facilities? And if it doesn't develop it, does it mean that they can no longer accept international passengers? Because we can travel virtually anywhere with one stop around the world. So I think it's fascinating. I think that in its own way is going to have such a knock-on effect in terms of networks and network structures. You know,
it absolutely is, isn't it? Yeah.
Take a hub airport like Dubai with, you know, its very concentrated hub and spoke network with literally thousands of passengers arriving in a 2-hour window and then reconnecting somewhere else. If there is a first and maybe perhaps a secondary level of health screening required for transit passengers, what will that do for connecting times? And because schedules will then need to be adjusted, that probably means, you know, at the end of you ripple that through quite significant changes to network structures. You might need more resources to operate the same number of flights, etc. It's, you know, it's a real challenge, and in part plays to the whole thing about social distancing on aircraft. Are we all going to sit next to each other in a 29-inch seat pitch and a 17-inch wide seat? Or are we going to expect more distance when we travel?
Yeah, and if you think about how much some airports have invested in developing the infrastructure and facilities to handle forecast growth, and all of those are built to design capabilities of throughput of passengers per hour, for example. And then suddenly there's a new regulation that says, you know, additional health screening or social distancing for a period of time or other things. Suddenly that theoretical capacity is halved or whatever it might be. And
it slows that down, doesn't it?
on infrastructure that creates is just unfathomable at the moment.
And I think actually, you know, it perhaps too early to be having those conversations yet with airports, but for sure an interesting subject matter for another webinar, you know, to actually talk to some airports about how they're contending with these challenges and how airlines and airports are going to have to work together to really make the best use of technology to facilitate that, I think. And, you know, we're seeing some questions about that too.
Yeah, and the whole area of biometrics, and, you know, there's huge discussion about identifying those people who've had the virus and therefore potentially are immune. You know, could you do something in their biometrics, on their passports and these types of things? Who knows?
Yeah.
But there's a whole industry about to start around health screening at airports that we've never seen before, which is fascinating.
And, you know, I think,
John,
sorry, KK, yeah, carry on.
Sorry, John, to your point on the impact on the transit passengers and the process of transiting in an airport, I think for an airline operator's point of view, I don't know what's the new requirement on the health concern and whatnot. If we are required to do deeper cleaning after every sector, that will definitely affect the utilization of the asset. And eventually it's the operational efficiency of the airline as well. I mean, I can no longer do 30-minute turn on a narrow body if I need to do deeper cleaning on every seat.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. That ripple effect is I don't think we've quite yet started to really try to quantify that, have we?
It's going to bring a lot of costs to the system.
Absolutely, KK. You know, I was just going to make the point, someone's going to have to pay for that cleaning cost because it's an additional cost. And, you know, do we get to the point where we, in this world of NDC, so, you know, additional ancillary revenues, you know, we will hopefully will never get there, but do you pay extra for a clean seat or a semi-clean seat or
Oh dear.
no, we just
Thank,
we have so
thanks for
many
the idea of the ancillary team.
yeah, we
It's
could, you know,
quite a
we could,
controversial, quite a controversial statement to
yeah,
have, but you know,
absolutely.
it's a good
We just do not
question.
know where
Yeah,
this is going to go, do you? I
yeah,
mean,
it's a
you
good
know,
question.
and people buying protective seat covers for themselves in airports before they get on the flight, you know, rather than buying a chicken Caesar salad, they actually buy a disposable seat cover so they can put it on the airline seat. Who knows?
Yeah.
Huge opportunities and challenges.
I mean, I think someone's asked the question, which sort of builds on that. Will we see a rise in airline passenger fares to get back airline losses? Airline losses, of course, you know, and airport losses. And I think there's a tension there, isn't there, about the sense that airlines might need to stimulate demand and put attractive fares out in the market, but actually there's a huge bit in the middle, isn't there, about recouping or trying to fly a profitable operation going forward.
There is. I mean, apart from, you know, those repatriation type flights where it is literally get the last aircraft out of town, and we're seeing some quite high fares being charged by some airlines. The truth is, at the moment, from data we've seen from some partners, that there is no great movement either up or down in terms of average selling fares in the market. You know, there is an argument that says perhaps airlines should be stimulating demand by putting some really cheap fares in the market. And the truth is, there isn't anything to stimulate at the moment. And at the other end of the spectrum, the argument that you should be charging higher because what capacity is going to be provided is going to be scarce. Well, again, for the same arguments around elasticity, no one is confident enough to do that. So broadly speaking, those commercial flights that are operating today have very similar airfares as those that were being charged this time last year.
I think it's also interesting, John, looking at the sentiment, whether it was business or leisure, and on one of our previous slides, and the sort of, I guess the discrepancy there, where leisure travellers are probably going to be a little bit more hesitant to come back. And I guess maybe Keiki might want to comment as well, but you know, relying on that leisure demand, booking that bit further out to give you confidence and visibility on your cash position. If that's not coming back, helping to give you visibility, then that's going to create a lot of short-term pressure as well on airlines coming out of the recovery.
Yeah. Which I think then feeds back into the need for funding and support across the piece, doesn't it? You know, and what that needs to actually look like.
And importantly, we are in a state of crisis. But if you take a holistic view of the whole industry, someone should be actually making the point of, you know, there is a philosophical piece about begin with the end in mind when we start these state aid packages and these airline supports, because what we are actually doing is creating a uneven playing field as we come out of this. You know, some airlines, such as Singapore Airlines, I mean, Singapore Airlines have got a huge investment, and I know some of it is about equity purchase, etc., etc. But around you, that must be quite concerning that they have taken or have secured such a large amount of additional cash.
Yeah, I mean, the bubble size is quite scary, to be honest. And it doesn't console me that I compete with a member of this SIA group on a few of my routes. But I think to your point, I think the state aid will probably be best used as a route incentive to protect connectivity rather than to help a private business to survive. I think state aid will probably be best used to protect connectivity, which is the most important for the country. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, KK, for that. We have time for a couple more questions. I'm conscious that we're rapidly approaching 9 a.m., which was our publicised end time, but there's a couple more questions I think here of interest. If you do have to drop off the webinar, we will of course be sending a recording, so you'll be able to access the last few minutes. David Miro's asked an interesting question here. So if we're not returning to the same situation we had before the crisis, how fast do we think that Asia Pacific Airlines will resume their flights to European destinations that they'd stopped flying to? And what conditions would make airlines fly back? And a really valid point, what can tourist boards and DMOs do to actually encourage flights to begin again?
This is a good question. I think I'll tackle the first bit before we sort of talk about the second in terms of DMOs and tourism boards. Well, good tourism boards now will be already beginning to look at what is their messaging and what is their product when this event is over. And for many, this is an opportunity to pause and think about, have they actually got their product proposition right for what will be probably a very different market. And the things that they need to pay attention to perhaps are things that we would have taken for granted as a traveller and assumed would have been just a normal everyday piece of business. So things such as hygiene standards, hotel cleanliness, sanitization, all of these issues for building confidence in the consumer that there is both a solid health infrastructure and that everything is being done that possibly can around the cleanliness of the destination, and at the same time, of course, trying to keep the natural character of that destination is quite important. As for when Asian Pacific Airlines return to Europe, I think we have to accept that there are probably 3 or 4 very large airlines in Asia Pacific who have major hubs and connecting traffic that will be able to bring and return services quicker than others. So I'm thinking of people like Singapore Airlines, I'm thinking of people like Cathay Pacific, perhaps Malaysia Airlines, again back into London Heathrow, and Thai International will want to return because the leisure and tourism market is so important to Thailand. But KK, you're really in the market. What's your perception on this?
To be honest, I'm not that pessimistic on service resumption on especially the trunk routes. Yeah, I think we'll probably make use. I think I cannot speak for all airlines, but I think airlines will probably make use of this opportunity to really take a deeper look on their own network. The non-essential, the marginal. The routes are probably not covering costs. That will probably be first to go. But if you have a strong reason, either financial reason or even any other special reason to maintain service, I think we'll probably resume as soon as the market conditions allow us to do so. Yeah, we have to look in context. Unless I can let go of all my aircraft leases, right? Because if I can't let go of all the aircraft leases, it's better to keep them flying.
Yeah, got to do something.
Yeah, I was just going to add a little comment about the tourism side. Before all this, there'd been some emerging discussions about over tourism of certain destinations, and I'm just literally putting out there as a thought that is there maybe an opportunity for some of those smaller or more discrete destinations who don't have issues of being a massive destination and thousands of tourists descending, is there maybe going to be a switch to the leisure passenger of thinking about where can I go that is slightly more isolated, dare I say, than where I would typically have gone for my vacation before?
Isolated.
What does that do for the marketing destinations?
Isolated and luxury, I guess, is something that.
But maybe not even luxury, John. Maybe they're just those emerging destinations that I'm going to take a chance and go there first, as opposed to going somewhere where I typically have gone before.
Well, I'll check out the isolated luxury. Mark, you check out the isolated emergent.
I think if you get I think if the messaging is right about health and you know, health screening and all of the things that we've been talking about, then potentially there's a real opportunity, isn't there? And actually, it plays right back into the need for governments to balance sustainability, both from the environmental perspective, but also in terms of destinations.
Absolutely.
I think
I hark back to Cancun, you know, where it went from 3 to 4 star to 5 star. And you know, there are going to be opportunities for, but it's really difficult at this moment in time, because we've seen this where tourism boards and destination management organizations say, we've got no money, this is not the time to be doing anything, you know, we need to bunker down and wait until the storm has passed. Absolutely not. This is the time to be doing these types of things and getting ready to come out of the other side. And, you know, using data as part of that whole process is a really important part of understanding what the future is going to look like.
Yeah, there's an opportunity, isn't there, you know, to try and regroup in the same way that we heard from KK, that, you know, airlines will be taking a deeper look at their own networks and what's working and what's not. There's an opportunity for destinations to do that too, isn't there? Okay, I think we're going to leave it there today. As always, really interesting debate, interesting questions. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us, both panelists and participants. As we mentioned earlier, we will be running another webinar later today where we'll go a bit deeper into the financial assistance question and this idea of sustainability being perhaps linked to support. And we'll also be joined by Ishka, who will give us some insight on the leasing market. And you mentioned that, KK. So I think we'll have an interesting conversation this afternoon. So please sign up for that. If you can't attend, you can always download the recording to listen again at a time of your choosing. So just some final thoughts to leave you with. If we haven't managed to answer your question during today, we'll do our best to reply in the coming days. And as we did before, we will be sending out a survey, a short one, after the webinar to get some feedback. So we'd appreciate if you could take a few moments to complete that. And a final reminder that we have a dedicated coronavirus page on OAG's website where you can sign up for regular updates as and when they go onto the website. And thank you to the panel for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.